Hi everyone, welcome back. Hope it's going well. Thought I would do a reading update today. It's been a while. Just talk about some books I've read or am reading at the moment. So I'll start out with some books I read a long time ago. I don't know. I've been revisiting stuff lately, but I've been rereading some Tom Clancy lately. I had this paperback of Red Storm Rising, which was published, I think, in 1986, I'm pretty sure. And this novel was I guess you call it like a World War III simulation novel, where it imagines a scenario where the Soviet Union is facing severe economic troubles and other things, and they decide they need to seize the oil fields in the Middle East. And to do that, first they need to destroy the NATO alliance. And this is like really more of a really heavy on military technology of the 1980s. And the novel really is, on one level, it's really interesting and fascinating. On other times, this book can be a bit tedious at times with all the technological information and all the equipment being named, whether it's different planes and submarines and tanks and things like that. But it is, interesting to imagine, like, what if that had happened. It's one of those what if books. And, it does paints a plausible scenario where much of the action in the book takes place in the North Atlantic around Iceland, that part of the world, because the Soviets are trying to destroy the supply lines of NATO because there's a stalemate in the war in Europe, and if they can, destroy the supply lines, they could defeat NATO. So that's really where the crux of the conflict happens in the book, to really kind of boil it down. It's very much a Reagan era book. It's a big, in some ways, I wouldn't call it propaganda necessarily, but almost an advertisement for what the increased military spending during the Reagan years, like what it could do if it ever had to be called into action and things like that. So there's, and the book, it does get a little bit predictable towards, I think, the end, where, unlike a lot of World War III books, not to spoil it, but this does not have, the apocalyptic endings with mushroom clouds or anything like that. And that's one thing I also found interesting of the book, where while it was usually claimed that if a shooting war ever broke out between the Soviets and the Americans and NATO, that it would quickly go nuclear. And in this book, that doesn't necessarily happen. The scenario in this book shows both sides being very reluctant to go with that option. So I did find that, because so much of the 80s was apocalyptic in its forecast of war and everything. So it's also a celebration of the military in the book, where all the main characters are military personnel, mostly male. There are a few female characters in the book, but it's mostly people from different backgrounds working together. It's almost a throwback to like the old World War II movies of people from different backgrounds and ethnicities working together to win. So and considering current events happening right now, with a war in Europe that's been going on for the past few years, it was a really kind of interesting, almost like going back into a alternate history with what this book does. So anyway, that's Red Storm Rising. I guess I just stayed on the Tom Clancy kick, and I started reading his first novel, The Hunt for Red October, which I might have read this in high school, and I just thought I was kind of curious to go back and do this. And of course, it's a great movie. I think one of the better movies, Cold War thriller movies or submarine thriller movies with espionage and everything. So this was, yeah, I'm just 100 or so pages into this, and this is the Jack Ryan series of books. You know, the Red Storm Rising is a standalone book, and this was, most of the Clancy books were Jack Ryan books. So this was one of the early adventures here. And like I said, a lot of tech, a lot you learn. There's a lot in here about submarines and submarine, strategy and tactics, and that's interesting if you can present that information in a compelling way, and you also learn about a little bit about how intelligence agencies work and what they do, and you do learn a little bit how the wider world works. And I think Clancy did bring some realism to it. It's not necessarily like an Ian Fleming or a this is like trying to go for some realism here as far as how intelligence work goes and everything. So it's like I said, kind of another interesting throwback to read. So yeah, just let's see, I started reading a biography of Abraham Lincoln. This is A. Lincoln by Ronald C. White. This was published in the 2000s, 2009. I used to read a lot of Lincoln biographies a while back. I kind of got away, but I thought, maybe I'll go back and do some reading about Lincoln again. And this was one of the relatively recent biographies I hadn't read. And so I'm about, I don't know, a fifth away or so into this. And yeah, so far it's good. It's a one-volume book, fairly compelling, kind of balance between Lincoln's life before the presidency and then obviously the focus on the presidency. And there's still a lot of books come out about Lincoln every year, looking at every aspect of his career, of his personal life, of his as a politician, as a political figure in American history, and all these things. So like I said, maybe it's the times we live in now that pulled me back to Lincoln a little bit. So, but yeah, I'm enjoying this. I might be, in the next few foreseeable future, might be doing some more reading on Lincoln. And let's see, I have a graphic novel I read, and this was one I just wanted to pick up. This is called Lucas Wars. This is a graphic novel about the making of the first Star Wars film, mainly from the perspective of George Lucas and the people around him at the time. This was published in France, I believe. The two authors, the writer and the artist, were French, and so I guess this is a translation in some ways. But I enjoyed it. The artwork was good, and we learned about. This is material that's been covered at length in many other books and things like that. But to see it in graphic novel form, I think was interesting. And Star Wars was a very difficult production, which Lucas had to start his own special effects company and dealt with a lot of pushback from the studio and things like that. So there's, yeah, like I said, it's a very quick read, and we get a lot here. Some of the artwork you can see there. So yeah, just definitely there's an emotional, strong. There's a lot of heart to the book as well, which I liked. And sure, there's maybe a little bit of romanticizing, sure, but it doesn't bother me. I'm okay with that. So okay, so yeah, a good graphic novel. And I guess I just have one more I want to talk about. This has been a Kindle book I've been reading. It's called Teenage: The Prehistory of Youth Culture by John Savage. You can kind of see the cover there. And this is about how the concept of the teenager evolved. How many look to like the 1940s and 1950s as when culture recognized teenagers as a distinct group of people. And this book really gets into the origins of that, which starting in the late 19th century and moving into the 20th century, where the idea was that, you know, one day you're in childhood and then one day you're an adult. And the idea of there being a transitional period between childhood and adulthood, it took a while for that idea to become, I guess, the way people viewed human development in culture. And so it's been a really interesting book so far. A lot of it is about gender and literature and nationalism, a lot of these currents that were happening at the end of the 19th century. So, for instance, the book gets into there was a new literature starting to spring up, whereas stories about young people, diaries, the idea that the teenage years were a very distinct time, and people were starting to read books that were giving insight into that teenagers live in their own world, you know, and have their own distinct view of things that's not quite childlike, not quite adult. So that was a source of fascination. And in a longer sense, the book gets into how society's always been a bit schizophrenic towards young people in general, where on the one hand, young people are looked at as saviors, like they are the children who will save us in the future. They will fix all the things that the adults messed up, right? So a lot of projection and a lot of like hope placed into the young. But the flip side of that is there's a lot of distrust and fear of the young. Okay, the fear of young people challenging the status quo and going against, you know, values, traditional values, and that tension has been a big part of, and it's still going on today, obviously. And the book, it's interesting how the book gets into that. A lot of it has to do with gender identity. What the book gets into, where I'm in the late 19th century now, and this is the age of nationalism. You had the British Empire at its height. Germany is a rising state. America is a rising state, and all these currents going on. So on the one hand, there was like this cultural anxiety about masculinity, that we need to make sure our society produces strong men, who will be able to fight wars and be the best of our nation. So there's like so much of this comes back to fears about masculinity, it seems like, but also anxiety about young women as well. So like there's this idea of men becoming too feminized, and this would push a lot of the militaristic side of things, and also a fear of young women moving away from traditional roles, and which once again is still a part happening today. All the anxiety and all the endless discourse on gender. But I guess the book really shows how this has been going on for a long, long, long time. It's really nothing new to that. And like there's a big section on Oscar Wilde, and the late Victorian writer who was really pushing against Victorian values, and how the establishment decided Wilde had to be suppressed, which he was. And like any kind of outburst of youth, whether it's politically or culturally driven, there's always a very strong reaction to it, and yet there's always a reaction to that too. So once again, Yeah, so it's a interesting book so far. Kind of a historical, sociological approach the author's taking. So yeah, those are mainly the books I've been reading and am reading right now. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.